Kim Ghattas, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Last week, there's of course the fear of escalation of the Hamas-Israel conflict. Are you, as a citizen of Lebanon, are you bracing yourselves for war there?
Well, the country is certainly very tense because we've been here before. In 2006, in fact, when there was a war between Hamas and Israel, Hezbollah, in an effort to support the Palestinians, carried out an operation on the border between Lebanon and Israel and kidnapped 3 Israeli soldiers. And the Israeli retaliation was devastating for Lebanon. 1,200 civilians killed, massive damage to Lebanon's civilian infrastructure. So there are concerns that this time Hezbollah will also try to intervene to support Hamas. So far, although there has been a lot of tension on the border between Lebanon and Israel and daily crossfire and 22 people killed, mostly combatants from Hezbollah, but also civilians, including 1 journalist, the rules of the game, if we can call it that, are still that of contained escalation. So neither Hezbollah nor Israel want this to become a wider war for now. And Hezbollah in particular is watching very carefully how things unfold in Gaza. What is most noticeable is the fact that its Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah, has not spoken yet. It's been 2 weeks since the October 7 attack by Hamas, and yet not a word by Hassan Nasrallah, including not about Israel's war on Gaza now. That tells me that Hezbollah is concerned about the potential for a wider conflagration. Don't forget you have US Navy warships in the Mediterranean as well. And it also tells me that Iran is very concerned about the fact that this could grow beyond just Gaza, because we assume that Iran is complicit with Hamas in the sense that it has provided arms and financing over the years. It's not always an easy relationship between Hamas and Iran, but it is there. And we assume, therefore, that Iran okayed this. But my read of this is that there was a blanket approval for operations. But my understanding from speaking to diplomats and Arab officials, Western diplomats and Arab officials, is that both Hezbollah and Iran were surprised by the extent of the operation. And so now they're looking for ways to de-escalate. Yeah. And another sign of efforts to de-escalate, of course, is the conversation between Iran's president and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Yeah. But going back to Lebanon, and I'll wrap up, this country is very tense at the moment because they understand the decision to go to war or keep it at peace lies in the hands of Hezbollah, not the government. And we've been through so much trauma in the past that you've had people leaving the country, schools closed, flights cancelled, and just general psychosis, particularly because Western embassies are sending out travel alerts asking their citizens to leave while commercial options are available.
Okay. Well, that's what you say about Iran's role as a key player in the background. Maybe we overestimated Iran's influence here, but let's have a look at President Biden and his trip to the Middle East. He and others went there and tried to warn, at least Biden tried to do that. He has to strike a balance, of course, between the solidarity for Israel and the talks with Arab leaders, many of whom gathered in Cairo yesterday, not very fruitfully. Is it noticed in the Arab world that Biden also warned Israel, that he said, don't let anger consume you, like we made mistakes after 9/11? Is that noticed?
Not very much, I must say. There's a lot of anger in the Arab world for the initial response by the West, whether it's President Biden or the EU, where it was all about support for Israel and Israel's right to defend itself with no caveats. And it's that lack of caveat which people read as an initial green light for Israel to do whatever it wants in response to the massacre carried out by Hamas. The caveats came later, and it's absolutely true that the reason why President Biden, but also many other Western leaders, and the US warships and the US Secretary of Defense rushed to Israel is because they were extremely concerned by Israel's potential retaliation, from carpet bombing Gaza to launching a preemptive strike against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so the US approach has had a calming effect, as you said, asking the Israelis to think carefully whether they want this to be a 9/11 in the sense that it will lead to 2 decades of war for no results, as we saw with the US and its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or whether perhaps they could see this as a Yom Kippur, the October 1973 war, which was a surprise, which took Israel by surprise when Egypt and Syria attacked, but eventually led to peace between Egypt and Israel. But there is a real sense in the Arab world that the double standards are still there, that the US and the West want Arabs to support Ukraine against Russia, that the West will call Russia's actions in Ukraine a war crime, that it will say that it's unacceptable to impose a siege on civilians, deprive them from water, etc., but they will not apply the same standards to Israel's actions. That is not to justify Hamas's actions, but there has to be equal application of international law and standards.
Yes. At the same time, Mrs. Ghattas, in the region we see images of protests on the streets. Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, West Bank. Do Arab leaders feel any pressure from that?
They most certainly feel pressure, and I actually was very surprised that the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, himself called for protests in support of the Palestinians. He might be completely disconnected from the reality of his people, surrounded by officials who are only saying yes to him. But the oppression that Egyptians are facing inside Egypt is tremendous. And so it's not surprising that these protests also turned into a protest against, to some extent, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi himself. Arab countries are walking a very fine line, particularly those who have a peace agreement or a normalization agreement or an Abraham Accords with Israel. And we heard King Abdullah in Cairo yesterday saying, you know, our lives appear to matter less to the West. Mm-hmm. Palestinian lives appear to matter less. They have to walk that fine line between being an ally of the US and responding to the anger of their people at this double standard and the fact that Palestinians, after all these years, continue to live under occupation, because all the focus is now on Gaza. But in the West Bank, it has been the most violent year for Palestinians since the Second Intifada, and the land grab by Israeli settlers continues right this moment. So beyond discussions about today's actions or tension on the border or what might Israel do in Gaza, it's important to zoom out and look at the big picture, which is that this is a festering wound in the Arab world, in the region, and we must refocus our minds on the core issue, which is the continued lack of political horizon for Palestinians.
In the end, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel?
I try always to focus on the hope on the horizon because of the incredible, terrible loss of life on both sides. We must look at opportunity here to find a long-term political horizon for Palestinians. And that's where I think that the Saudis have a role to play. Their normalization talks with Israel are now not formally suspended, but on hold. Can they find a way to get the Israelis to understand that it is in their interest, in Israel's interest, to truly give concessions to the Palestinians to allow this normalization deal to go through between the Israelis and the Saudis? Because the Saudis have been frustrated about the lack of compromises that the Israelis were willing to do to give to the Palestinians in return for relations with Saudi Arabia. This Palestinian cause is a card that the Iranians use constantly to increase, improve, heighten their role in the region. And it's now up to Saudi Arabia, hopefully with the help of the US, to try to wrestle that card away from the Iranians and give a political horizon to the Palestinians and help bring an end to the occupation of Palestinian territories.
Kim Ghattas in Lebanon, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Bedankt voor het kijken. En vond je dit een goed gesprek? Vergeet je dan niet te abonneren. Een like of een comment achterlaten kan natuurlijk ook. Oh ja, had je dit al gehoord?
Dus we zijn ook in slaap gesust. En daar heeft Hamas nu op de meest gruwelijke manier misbruik van gemaakt. Dus dat mag ons niet meer overkomen.
Nee,